Good day, my brethren. It's been a while since I called anyone that. Well, I suppose it's not really my brethren. It depends if I make this video listed or not, public, whatever. It's not really a video, to be honest. So, on DeviantArt, I go by the name of Weldit. And recently one of my characters got into I say recently. This story was released around this time. This sort of week. About 2 weeks ago. I last read it about 2 weeks ago as well. But it's just awesome. And I'm gonna read it. Evangelion, the End and After Revelations. It's a prequel to Carolyn Burnford's, or Carola Burnford's, whatever their name is. Really strange name. Where the hell is it? We can go into the documents and we can find a picture. It says Carolee Burnford, but I swear it had an N before, so it was Carolyn Burnford. Something Burnford, alright? And it's a prequel to their sort of Oscar X Rayfic fanfiction on the very same website. Isn't on fanfiction for, I don't know, I'm not sure. And it's a prequel. So yeah. Sort of prequel, almost. Anyway, I digress. You just want to hear it, don't you? It's, one sort of thing, last thing, it's about 40 pages long, which is quite long by these standards. I've no idea how long it's gonna take me to read it. So, here I go. The air was cold and bright over the waters of the far north. What few clouds could be seen in the pale blue sky were high and ragged. Natalie Brayton Fujinami stood at the rail of the icebreaker ship and looked north. Red water and the occasional shred of melting ice passed beneath her vision as the ship moved onwards towards its chilly destination. The ship they were sailing had been at sea for many weeks of calm seas and gradually worsening visibility. Its name was Tor, an old Russian icebreaker, old but serviceable. It had been built in the mid to late 20th century by Finnish shipwrights before being sold to Sweden and eventually Russia. It was a grand old lady of the sea, and where its great diesel turbines occasionally faltered, its hull was thick and well maintained, its crew experienced and durable. It was a castle on the water, huge and constant, complete with layered ramparts and battlements and towers for viewing further out to sea. Sometimes she thought that only the apocalypse could possibly sink it. Then she remembered the apocalypse had already tried and failed. Twice. Although that wasn't entirely true. The tidal forces that had ravaged the globe during Third Impact had in fact left it beached in literal dry docks, where other places had been flooded under hundreds of feet of red water. Now that red water had receded around the globe, letting life take tentative steps back into the oceans. The Tor had been rescued from the dry bed it had been consigned to and winched and towed 20 miles to open waters before being repaired and refitted for work once more. It wasn't long after that Nerve found it and repurposed it, and only shortly after that they did the same with Natalie. "Cold today?" said a voice from over her shoulder. "It's cold every day," replied Natalie, knowing exactly what would be behind her without having to look round. "It's only going to get colder." "Too cold for you?" She looked at the breath misting in front of her. "I don't mind the cold normally, But when it's cold enough to kill you... She turned, and sure enough, Marco was standing there, that permanently mild smile on his face. "Where are the others?" she asked. "Oh, they're around, I'm sure," replied Marco. "I can't keep an eye on you kids all the time." Natalie frowned at his use of the word kids. It was a little too close to their captain's attitude to her and her team. But that's what they were. A team. At least that was what Natalie had tried to make them in the short time they had been together. "I saw Alex a short while ago in the canteen getting an early lunch," continued Marco. "Amy and Kiara are probably being kept entertained by the crew as usual. River, well... River could be anywhere, you know what she's like. But I'm guessing she's probably down in the engine rooms again. You and I are the only ones crazy enough to actually enjoy spending an extended period out on deck." She ignored the crazy remark. "So are you saying you do like it this cold?" Marco shrugged. "I don't seem to mind it as much as you and the others. But then, you're all skinny little things. I have the added advantage of my extra layers of whale blubber." Natalie scoffed. The man was exaggerating again. Marco seemed to enjoy putting himself down. He almost made a habit of it. Sure, he carried a few extra pounds around with him, but that wasn't exactly unusual, especially in her home country. "You should have seen some of the people in my hometown," she replied. "You haven't seen fat until you've seen American fat. You forget. I've lived in America for much of my life, so I've seen just as much as you have. Besides, you look to have turned out okay," replied Marco. She waved this away, dismissively. "I was in the military." "So was I," he pointed out. "Yes, as a technician. You were hardly on the front lines, were you?" Natalie caught the ghost of a pained expression on his face and regretted rising to his bait. He might have been a glutton for self-punishment, but that didn't mean he handled others' criticism better than anyone else. She got the feeling his military service was something of a sore point with him, as if he thought real-line support work was somehow less worthy than the life of a full combatant. Not that she had ever seen real combat either. The global wars of her childhood had died away by the time she had reached an age where she might even think of getting involved in the fighting. She had joined the Reserve Officer Training Corps at the age of 13, against her father's wishes, and had then entered nerve training programs just before the age of 15, having been plucked from the ROTC prior to graduation. It was there that she'd met that girl, and had subsequently gained a whole new perspective on the world. Third Impact had then put paid to any plans she might have had after that. Marco joined her to the railing, leaning on it as they stared out into the Red Sea. The blue might be returning around the rest of the world, but here in the Arctic the water steadfastly refused to change its hue. Nobody seemed sure exactly why that was. Pretty soon, of course, the red would be lost beneath constant, unending sheets of brilliant ice, and visible only in their wake and down the side of the hull, where the breaker prow clove the ice to provide passage. But for now, only scraps of white dotted the Arctic's water. The weather had been threatening for the past week, but today the skies were orange-tinted blue, and the sun was easily visible. A breaking cloud had also brought bitter temperatures, a taste of things to come. 4 more days, the captain says. 4 more days and we'll be at our destination. Though I still don't know where that is. Marco trailed off, looking pointedly at Natalie. He might have been the oldest in their group at 29, almost twice the age of Natalie and the other children, as the captain dismissively called them, but he seemed happy to look at her as they did for a lead. In her darker moments, Natalie thought it rather unfair to put such a burden on a 16-year-old. Still, it would do her no good complaining about it now. She'd had plenty of opportunity to do that when nerve had found her again, and after that girl had contacted her. "You know as much as I do," lied Natalie. "I was told not to open the sealed orders until we reached the appropriate coordinates." That last part was at least true. However, she already knew what they contained. Is that why you're always up here staring out into the sea like you're sailing towards some kind of doomsday? He asked. She glanced at him. Was he better at reading people than she had thought? He just grinned back at her from behind his thick-rimmed glasses, and under that humorously big fur hat he had taken to wear in the chilly north. "We've already survived the apocalypse, Marco," she replied. "I've survived it twice, actually," he said, and she thought there might even be a hint of pride in his voice at that declaration. "Once in my home country, and once in America. I'm a two-time survivor. God obviously doesn't want me to die." He had been born in Costa Rica, she knew. It was one of the countries that had suffered the hardest in the aftermath of Second Impact. War, drought, and famine had consumed much of the Southern and Central Americas, forcing many to flee, Marco's family among them. He had emigrated to America in his early teens and had moved around for much of his young adult and adult life, even after he had joined the armed forces. All of the relevant information had been in the files Nerve had provided her with when she had accepted this assignment. Her brief stay in the Marines, cut short by declining levels of fitness and apparent lack of application, after which he had been moved to the back lines and shown accomplishment in technical roles, eventually attaining the rank of Technical Control Chief, a position he held for 2 years before again inexplicably leaving the post and the armed forces as a whole to take up freelance work as a special technical advisor for various private military companies. Eventually, he was recruited by Nerve and worked both in an advisory role for Section 2 and in the technical departments of both Nerve headquarters and latterly Nerve 1 in Massachusetts. He had been there when Natalie had been there, although their paths had never crossed, at least not with either of them knowing. "You believe in God?" she asked. "Catholic," he replied. Lapsed. "It's difficult to have a faith after everything we've been through. Then again, I don't have much faith in humanity either as it stands. We tried to create our own God, after all, and look how that turned out. And this could all be divine punishment, so to speak." Marco chuckled darkly. "I believe we'll find out one of these days, one way or another. Though I doubt we'd like the answer, either way." "Don't worry, Marco," she said, touching the badge on her left breast pocket. "This will all be sorted in a few days' time. Then we can go back to our boring lives rebuilding the world. Everything will work out fine." "Maybe you're right," he replied. She nodded and smiled a smile that didn't feel entirely genuine. "I'm always right," she replied, "and I'm right about this. God's in his heaven, after all." Marco looked out to sea again, resting on his folded arms. "You know, that's really not very funny," he told her. "I know," replied Natalie. Next chapter, so to speak. So I've decided I'm going to stick with the English accent because I have a sore throat right now, and yeah, only my own English accent. Not trying to make any girly voices or American accents or anything. Just stick to English. Sorry. When the men in dark suits came to her door, she had immediately known who they represented. A chill of fear had gone through her at what their appearance must mean. For her, for this new world, for humanity, none of it could be good. "Miss Brayton Fujinami?" the old man of the three had asked. She had nodded. A few minutes later, she had let them into a small home. The men were led to a small table and chairs in the single room of the downstairs living area. Everything she had was in this room: her meager possessions, her books, her tools, her mementos of the past. The room was big enough that it could encompass a sink for washing and cleaning, a few recovered armchairs and a small coffee table, a larger dining table, and a stove. An old cupboard with an inset mirror stood next to a window, with trinkets and tattered copies of disparate reading material placed upon and contained within. The mirror, however, had old curtain cloth taped over it, one corner of which was peeling away and was yet to be restuck. One of the men commented on the mirror, querying why it had been covered. "It's broken," replied Natalie simply. They sat in the worn armchairs with a small table in between them. The two younger men remained standing, however. The man that seemed to want to do all the talking was probably in his 50s, with greying hair and bushy eyebrows. He was clean-shaven and dressed in an identical dark suit to those of the younger two men standing behind his chair were wearing. If Natalie had been the pessimistic type, she would have said the three men looked a lot like Section 2 operatives. The seated man talked for a long time about the state that the world found itself in, filling her in on things she didn't need to know, like the formation of the European Council, the building of the Japanese city of Kaibayaku, the return of the UN Secretary General, the appalling losses of humanity, and the world population that hovered on the brink of collapse. He didn't need to tell her these things. She only had to look out of her window to see the rebuilding of life going on. Life that had been so close to extinction. He also talked about things like duty and honor, old-fashioned concepts in the modern post-Third Impact world. All the while he talked, Natalie stared out of the window at the fields around the small community where good people were planting crops or building houses. She ought to have been out there with them, but instead she was stuck listening to a man who didn't realize how out of date he was. When he mentioned the word responsibility, she looked at him and then sat forward. She saw all three men tense slightly and realized that in spite of the fact she was a fraction of their respective ages and about half their bulk, they were frightened of her. And why not? She was a potential after all, one of Nerve's chosen. The Marduk Institute had selected her as an Ava pilot, as first backup to the children in Japan should one of them fail in the task of piloting their Avas. There had even been talk that she might have her own Ava commissioned for her. That was when she and the vast majority of the rest of humanity had been unaware of the Ava's true purpose and terrifying potential. "My responsibility?" she asked the man, who had shrunk back in his seat as she had sat forward. "What do you know of my responsibilities?" "I know you feel responsible for a lot of the suffering that people are going through right now," he replied nervously. "But you have the chance to make a difference again, to do something important." Sudden anger coursed through her. "Working for you people? Why on earth would I do that? Why do that, rather than going outside and telling those people laboring to fix what we broke exactly who you are?" The man's eyes followed her pointing finger out of the window to the people working industriously in the fields beyond. "You think they would hurt us, and you may be right. But before you do that, just think to yourself, are these three men in front of you really what you accuse them of being? We were all working for Nerve with the best of intentions, protecting humanity. We didn't know what disease lay at the heart of the organization any more than you did. We didn't know about Sele and the Human Instrumentality Committee. If we had, we too would have done things differently." Natalie sat back in her chair, frowning. It was an honest answer, one she hadn't expected and she couldn't argue with. Despite what had happened, the majority of the people working for Nerve were doing so for the right reasons. Or at least for everyday reasons like supporting a family or building a career. The man saw her discomfort and reached into an attaché case at his side. "Please, have a look at these." He placed 5 files on her table. She eyed them suspiciously, but didn't reach out for them. They had names on them, and photos paper-clipped to the corners. "What are these?" she asked. "They're files on the rest of your team," he replied. "You are right, of course. We would like you to come and work for us again." "Why?" she asked, staring directly at him. The man looked a little flustered by the direct question. He glanced at the two men behind him, but they only looked impassive, not offering any help. "Well, because you're needed," he said, turning back to her. "You do still want to help protect humanity, don't you?" She glanced out of the window again at the busy, industrious people. She knew what her father would have wanted her to do. He'd been an army colonel, retired long before Nerve had ever come calling for her. but had served during the global wars that had torn the world apart after Second Impact, had seen its horrors, and had been against her enrollment in the ROTC and her recruitment by Nerve. Vehemently so, after her mother, a technician at the Nevada branch, had disappeared, along with the rest of Nerve 2 during the S2 implantation experiments. He would have wanted her to stay, to help rebuild, to put her past behind her and settle for a simple life. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't think for too long," he replied, snapping his attaché case closed again. "There's a ship docked at the old Boston harbor waiting for you. It'll wait for a week, no longer. Its name is the Tor, an old Russian icebreaker. Further instructions will be awaiting you on board." "I'll think about it," she replied. The older man glanced at the two standing behind him. They knew their time was up. He stood and offered a hand to Natalie. When she didn't take it, he straightened. "I know you don't like us, Miss Fujinami, but I hope you'll still consider this seriously. You were destined for great things before. I hope you can see that there are more ways to help humanity than building houses." Natalie didn't reply, but she stood and showed them to the exit. As the three men passed through her front door, the older man turned back as if he'd remembered something. "Oh, one last question before we go, if you wouldn't mind. I wonder if you've had any contact with the girl Mari Illustrious Makanami?" Natalie frowned. "She was in the same Nerve program as me. The instructors called her the problem child, which was understandable. She went missing shortly before Third Impact." The man winced at her mention of the near apocalypse. "So you haven't seen her since?" he asked. "No, of course not," she replied. "Why would you even think I would?" He looked disappointed. "I understood you two were quite close at one point." "Well, you heard wrong," replied Natalie. "That girl was a menace, reckless and thoughtless to everyone around her. If it had been in her interests, she would have let all of her friends and colleagues die without hesitation." "Ah, I see," he replied, looking a bit taken aback by the vehemence in her voice. When they had gone, Natalie turned back to the living room. She crossed the floor to the cupboard that stood between the window and the wall. Down the side of it, in the corner, almost out of view and gathering dust, a long, squarish case sat on its end. It was covered in worn synthetic fabric of a dark blue, and had a zip that circumnavigated its slender bulk. Natalie looked at it for a long while, wanting to pick it up, but fearing what it would mean if she did. "They were asking for me?" said a voice from behind her. She looked around to see the girl walking down her stairs and into the living area. Her long brown hair was tied in low pigtails, the way she always remembered her wearing it. But she was dressed in dark blue jeans and an old army jacket from some obscure pre-impact militia. The oval-rimmed glasses she wore did little to mask that familiar, confident half-smirk Natalie remembered from old times. Mari Illustrious Makanami had never lost that look in the entire time she had known her. "They were," she replied, looking back at the case. "I told you they would come," said Mari lightly. "Didn't I tell you?" Natalie sighed. "Yes, you told me. So what are you going to do? Does that case come out of its dusty corner? Are you going to get back in the game?" Natalie whirled on her. "Is that all this ever was to you?" she chattered. "A game? People died, Mari. Millions of people. The world nearly died with them." "But it didn't," replied Mari. She was grinning her dangerous grin. "We tried to save as many as possible, didn't we? Didn't we agree that this is what happens when you leave the running of the world to the adults, to old men in dark rooms? We'll be adults soon," countered Natalie. "But we'll never be old men," said Mari, her grin widening. Natalie sagged and sighed. She'd never been able to deal with Mari. She didn't even understand why Mari took any kind of interest in her at all. The Brit had outdone the whole class in every test score going. Even Natalie had had trouble keeping up with her. If it wasn't for her rebellious nature, she'd have been first in line for an Ava, rather than Natalie herself. But of course, Mari had known that. She had intuitively seen the cancer eating away at nerve, and had removed herself from that equation, preferring to try to do things on her own way. If only Natalie had listened and done the same. "What do they want me to do?" she asked. Mari shrugged. Then she leaned over the table and began looking through the files. "I'm not sure, but if they're putting you on an icebreaker, it stands to reason your destination is either Arctic or Antarctic." "You knew they were coming, but you had no idea what for?" asked Natalie. "Whatever it is, it's important," replied Mari, leafing through bits of paper. "They've got a whole roster of potential heirs. I know some of these kids. Not personally, just through investigation." "I don't doubt it," replied Natalie, picking up one of the files. The name on the front read River Knight. A photo clipped to the corner showed a skinny girl about her age with messy brown hair that fell into her face and dark rings that underlined soulful eyes. "My guess is, these guys will know even less than you," said Mari, dropping the file she was holding back onto the table. Then she reached inside her jacket, pulling out some papers of her own from the inner pocket. She handed Natalie a photo. "I've done my own digging around. This is the man you have to look out for. Everyone else you're going to meet is likely window dressing." She looked at the photo in her hand. It showed an elderly man with an unremarkable face and greying hair. "Who is he?" she asked. "If I knew, I wouldn't need you to get on that ship," replied Mari with a grin. "So all you really want is a fall guy," said Natalie. "Not just any fall guy," replied the Brit. "No one can do it but you." Natalie glanced at the blue case by the cupboard. "I nearly killed that boy," she told her old friend. "Then do this as some way of making up for what happened. Things are moving again, and I can't see to all of it. I need you, Natalie." She knew what Mari was doing. She was appealing to her conscience, and she was doing a better job than those three men had. She stood and walked to the cupboard. For just a brief moment she caught sight of her reflection in the uncovered corner of the mirror, but quickly looked away again, directing her gaze instead back to the dark blue case. "So you want me to go sailing off around the world at your whim," said Natalie. "And what is it that you'll be doing in the meantime?" "Oh, I'll be getting into trouble as usual," replied Mari. Natalie took a deep breath, then nodded and reached for the case. As it should be. Chapter breaks, marked by intense episodes of coughing. Tor's journey had taken it on a winding route, starting in America, where it picked up the first two of its passengers, Marco being one and the girl Natalie the other. It had sailed across the Atlantic, stopping in Lisbon, Portugal, to take on supplies, before travelling north to Portsmouth in the UK, where three further members of his team came aboard. Their last stop had been Bremerhaven in Germany, where River Knight had reluctantly joined them. The final member was also a child. At 29 years of age, Marco didn't think of himself as old, but when all five other members of the supposedly elite team were virtually half the age he was, sometimes he felt less like the group's technical and communications expert and more like a common babysitter. It had been a surprise to meet the leader of his unit all these weeks ago in Boston Harbor, and to learn that she was a 16-year-old girl. That surprise had melted into disquiet as each new member had joined, each of them as young as the last. He tried not to let it show on his face, attempting to keep upbeat more for his own sake than that of the children, as their captain insisted in calling them. It didn't help that their mission to the frozen north was so vague. Sometimes he regretted agreeing so readily to leave his menial position at the Boston Technical Council. Fortunately, Natalie at least appeared to have her head screwed on. The others, while enthusiastic, were not quite so mature for their age as she appeared to be. Their passage then took them north, round to the Norwegian fjords and into open waters. Now they were a day's sail from Svalbard, their last sight of land before they hit the ice fields of the Arctic, and their ultimate destination remained a mystery to them, a secret kept by one more passenger who had been on the boat even since before Boston. The woman from Nerve was in her late 30s, and was as cold as the ice fields they would soon be entering. Her blonde hair and sharp face were not unattractive, but Marco would never think of making a pass at her. Her name was Lind. She was of mixed background with a strange, unidentifiable accent, possibly part German, maybe part Scottish. She spoke English and Japanese fluently, but rarely conversed with Marco and the others, or even with the crew. In fact, it seemed she had rarely even left her cabin, so it had been a surprise when she had called them together in a private conference room. River, as usual, was the last to arrive. The others all watched as she stalked into the room and took her place at the round table, where she sat back in her seat and folded her arms, disinterestedly looking away from the others. Her expression neutral. Lind looked around at them all. Alex Rogers, a tall young man from the UK with a mop of blonde hair, brown eyes, and a carefree expression on his handsome face. The Sakurai twins, Amy and Kiara, who looked so similar even though they had different coloured hair and eyes. Amy's being long and lustrous black with bright, almost icy blue eyes, and Kiara having beautiful auburn hair of a similar length that she always tied in low pigtails, and hazel eyes flecked with molten gold. Natalie Brayton Fujinami, their leader, was athletic, with dark hair that she always tied up in a ponytail, and ever-present glasses with thin metal rims. She was looking at Lind with an expression of such utter focus, Marco thought it was a wonder the woman didn't burst into flames. "Now that you are all here," began Lind, "I can tell you what it is you are here to do. I believe I gave each of you sealed documents with orders for your upcoming mission and instructions to open them only when I called you all together like this. The time has come for you to open them." Marco felt in his pocket and drew out the envelope he had been given upon boarding the tour in Boston. It bore his full name, Marco Antonio Salazar Matamoros, and was stamped with the Nerve logo. He looked around the table, waiting for the others to do the same. "Oh, those," said Natalie. "I opened those the night I came aboard in Boston Harbor." Alexander looked at her, then at Lind. Yeah. Portsmouth for me, but yeah." River reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled and obviously opened envelope, tossing it onto the table. Even Amy and Kiara glanced guiltily at one another. Marco began to feel a little foolish at having kept his in a safe place, unopened and unread. He hurriedly broke the seal on his envelope and pulled out the single sheet of typed paper, scanning it quickly. Lind watched him and smiled a tight smile. "Well then, I suppose this will go a bit quicker," she said. "Wait," said one of the Sakurai twins, the auburn-haired Kiara. "Before we go any further, I want to know why Amy and I are here." She looked at her sister, who nodded. "Excuse me for saying," said Amy, picking up where her sister had left off, "but this seems like a military operation of some kind. Kiara and I, well, we aren't really soldiers or anything. So, I mean..." She trailed off, looking nervously at her sister. "Why us?" asked Kiara, clasping her hands on the tabletop. "We've had no training. We've never even left the UK before, except on school trips. Well, not since we were little kids, anyway. Everyone here's been so nice to us, but why are we even here?" "It said in the orders that we were to retrieve something," agreed Alex. "I've had some kind of training. I was in the Air Cadets, after all. Natalie has too. She was even part of Nerve." Natalie looked at him sharply, surprise on her face. Alex noticed and looked apologetic. "I've wanted to be an Ava pilot," he said. "I was an avid follower of potential pilots. Plus, my mum was a politician and Dad was in Section 2, so naturally I knew about you, and Asuka, Mari, and Shinji. Even Rei Ayanami, though I didn't know what she truly was until, well, you know." "What was she?" asked Kiara. "I still don't know. I have these memories in my head, but I can't seem to make sense of them." "If you wouldn't mind," said Lind, her cold voice cutting through the chatter like a shard of ice. "If you're quite finished, we can proceed." He's right, though, said Natalie, sitting forward and fixing Lind with a hard stare. Why send school children on a mission? Why not a unit of soldiers? Because of your nature, said Lind. Silence followed her words. Clearly, 4 of the 5 kids were confused by this. Even River was studying Lind with a sidelong look, her dark, ringed eyes peeking out from where her wavy brown hair fell into her face. Each of you, save for Marco, of course, were marked by the Marduk report as potential Ava pilots, clarified Lind. All of you were the right age. You all possessed qualities consistent with the requirements of piloting. Yes, Kiara, even you and Amy. It is this fact that is important in your coming mission. Amy, Kiara, Alex, and River all looked astonished at this revelation. Although, to Marco, Natalie looked as if something she had suspected had just been confirmed. Why do you need potentials? Asked Marco. He held up his orders. This says we're to retrieve something from the polar ice cap. Why would you need potentials for that? It also detailed his involvement in the mission. He was to be the technical support, the communications officer, and their link with the boat. So not only will I be babysitting these kids, I'll also be hauling heavy equipment across the polar landscape, he thought to himself, wryly. What are we looking for? He asked, placing his envelope on the table again. An artifact. A very powerful weapon, said Lind directly. Why? Who needs a weapon? Asked Alex. Humanity. 5 of the 6 looked at one another. The only one who stared straight ahead was Natalie. Her eyes never left the woman. We believe that your destination is the site of which mankind's greatest weapon now lies. And no, I don't mean the Avas. This is a much older weapon. What is it? Asked Natalie. Longinus. The name hung in the air for a very long time until... What's Longinus? Asked Amy. The Lance of Longinus is the fabled weapon used to pierce Christ's side as he was crucified on the cross, said Natalie, recalling her lore. Isn't that right, Marco? He nodded and picked up where she had left off. There were supposedly relics claiming to be the original lance held in museums and reliquaries all over the world, though none were ever proven to be genuine. This lance, however, has had the name attributed to it after the fact. Or perhaps not. Perhaps this was the original Longinus, that all others were pale imitations of. But I thought Longinus was destroyed along with the mass-produced Avas, said Alex. They were also just copies, said Lind. Another lance was created by Shinji during instrumentality, but the real Longinus was taken in by Rei. It would be within her body, within her remains. And her remains, asked Kiara, are near the North Pole. They looked at one another. You still haven't answered why you need us, rather than a unit of trained soldiers to retrieve it, said Alex. Marco was starting to appreciate the clear thinking of the 15-year-old boy. In fact, wasn't it the case that all of the kids were reacting with remarkable maturity to the situation that thrust itself upon them? Lind stood up and retrieved a case from across the room. She sat it on the table and opened the clasps with quick snaps, setting the top up so she could get inside. From its confines, she drew several large photographs that she tossed onto the table. Hesitantly, they reached for one. The images were of aerial surveillance photos. They showed a series of dark boxes against stark white snow. A quick count revealed there to be 16 of them, all lying in what appeared to be a deep crater in the polar cap. Something about that number rang alarm bells with Marco. We have reason to believe the lance, or parts of the lance, have been contained within one or many of the objects you see in those photos. We have reason to believe that here are boxes or containers of some kind, and that they are manufactured from some form of Ava technology. It stands to reason that they will not open to just anyone. It is my belief and the belief of many in the New Nerve organization that those considered to be potentials by the Marduk report are most likely to be able to sync with these containers and access their contents. You are all of the potentials that remain available to us at Nerve. To give us the best possible chance of a successful retrieval of the Lance, we need all of you. Well, that answers all of my questions, said Alex. Frankly, I'm finding all of this quite exciting. Natalie turned a severe expression on him, and he wilted slightly under her glare. I have one last question, said Marco. You say you need this weapon for humanity's sake, but Longinus was beyond deadly and was easily misused before. I want to know why humanity would need a weapon like that. What possible reason would you have for wanting it? Because, Mr. Matamoros, said Lind, her voice as chilly as ever, the angels have returned. I swear I'm going to die from this. That really is not a healthy cough. Oh man, I think I'll be once I've finished with this. Oh my god. 10. I've still got about 30 pages to go. Oh man.
This is a really bad cough. I hate this. It hurts so much. Ugh.
The tour sighted Svalbard during the night, though actually due to the shortened daylight hours in the far north, it being late winter, it was actually more like mid to late morning. Alex had been awake for hours, having taken breakfast early, and had been brooding in his cabin with a shout went around the boat. At first, he thought there was some kind of emergency, and jumped out of his bunk. When he opened his cabin door, Amy stood there, hand raised as if she had been about to knock, and a startled look on her face. "What's going on?" asked Alex, craning to look into the corridor. Crew members were jogging past. "Is something wrong?" "No!" squeaked Amy. She lowered her hand and cleared her throat. "It's Svalbard! We're coming up on Svalbard! The captain thought we'd like to see it with the sun coming up behind. He says it's quite beautiful." "Oh," said Alex Bermutes. "Okay, let's go then. Chiara says we've got to get Natalie too. She's getting Marco and River. I think she's got something planned." Alex pulled on his nerve issue jacket and a pair of mittens, and they went down the corridor to Natalie's room. "What's going on?" asked Natalie, who swung the door open as soon as they knocked. She was already fully garbed in the winter uniform they had each been given, and had her case slung over her shoulder. "Are we under attack?" "Attack?" asked Amy, frowning. "Who would be attacking us?" "Never mind," replied Natalie. Alex glanced around her cabin. It was the same as his. Small, with a table and bunk, a mirror on the wall behind the table, and a porthole window. Alex saw that for some reason Natalie had pulled the porthole curtain down and hung it over her mirror. "Problem?" asked Natalie, looking at him. Alex jumped. "No," he replied, embarrassed at being caught. "What do you want then?" asked Natalie, a little irritably. "Chiara wants us to go up on deck," said Amy excitedly. "Why?" asked Natalie. "It's Svalbard," explained Alex. "The crew have just sighted the island. I think we're going up on deck to view it." "Come on, Nat," urged Amy, and she seized Natalie's hand, dragging her forward. "You don't need to bring that," she continued, indicating the case over Natalie's shoulder. "I think I'll keep hold of it," replied Natalie, but she allowed herself to be pulled out into the corridor. Alex grinned at her apologetically as they began making their way through the innards of the ship, up to the forward decking. As they emerged into the slowly lightening gloom up top, they found Chiara and Marco already waiting for them. "Come on," urged Chiara. "It's really beautiful, even before dawn." She led them around the side of the main superstructure to the upper foredeck. "I couldn't find River," she continued, "so she'll just have to miss this, and more for her for never—" "Miss what?" asked a voice. Chiara jumped and squeaked in surprise, looking up to where River was seated on a covered winch, arms wrapped around her knees and gloved hands loosely clasped together. The young German looked down curiously at them. "There you are!" exclaimed Chiara. "I was looking all over for you." River stood and jumped down from the winch, landing lightly on the deck. "I've been here for half an hour waiting for the sun to come up," she said. with a nonchalant shrug. She brushed the hair out of her eyes and looked around at them. What took you all so long? Alex thought there was a slight smile on her face. He found it difficult not to like the girl, in spite of her generally aloof and antisocial demeanor. She was definitely the strangest of the six-strong group, an enigma as soon as she had stepped on board. Alex had been contacted by Nerve while in the Greater London megatropolis. He didn't know how they had found him. None of his family, that he knew of, had returned from instrumentality, certainly not his parents, his politician mother and security specialist father. When he decided to leave the Sea of Souls, Alex had felt intuitively that he had his parents' blessing to do so, but the discovery that they had not also decided to join him had been hard to bear. In the aftermath, he had been struggling to survive in the remains of the once great city, working with other attorneys to grind a life from the shattered buildings and crumbled institutes. When Nerve had found him, he had jumped at the opportunity they had presented, an opportunity for meaning and even adventure, the desire for which had once flowed strong in his veins. It was true, he had once wanted to be an Ava pilot, and when that seemed an impossibility, he had transferred his energies to becoming a pilot of planes. The Air Cadets had been his route to that end. From there, he would have moved into the full Royal Air Force. He had trained in gliders and had had a few flights in light aircraft, but Third Impact had begun before he'd had the chance to accomplish his goal. His desire for excitement and adventure had become a guilty memory after that, when the world needed to be rebuilt. But even that guilt hadn't quenched the thirst. Being found by Nerve had been both the culmination and shattering of that guilt, as he had found true purpose again, purpose beyond the simple struggle for survival. It felt like an honor to join with people like Natalie and Marco. True, Amy and Kiara had seemed like strange choices to be along for the mission, having no military background as they did, but even that became clear with a revelation about them all being potentials, and each one of them earmarked by the Marduk Institute, and the real puppet masters behind that sham company. But River had felt different from the start. As soon as she had joined them at Bremerhaven, he had known there was something about the girl that went beyond the ordinary. He wasn't sure if the others had come to the same conclusion, but her demeanor, her reluctance to board, even while standing on the gangway ramp, her apparent need for seclusion from the others, and her mysterious nature all contributed to the feeling that there was more to her than she let on. It was not that she was unfriendly, of course. If anything, she was as shy as Amy and as amiable as her twin sister Kiara. But there was a sense to her that she had her own secrets she would be loath to give up, even to her teammates. Alex suddenly realized she had noticed him staring at her, and he looked away, a slight blush leaping unbidden to his cheeks. "Well," said Kiara, "now that we're all here, I present to you Safarbard." She gestured across the deck and out to sea. In the distance, with the lightning sky behind it, was a mass of snow-covered land, hills, and mountains growing out of the sea. The mountains were like a pale violet smoke between the yellow-blue sky and the deep red seas. "Wow, it is beautiful," said Natalie with grudging admiration. "Thank you for calling us up here to see this, Kiara. That's not all I brought you up here for," replied the girl, her eyes shining with glee. She looked upwards. "Captain? How long?" The captain, a curmudgeonly old Russian seafarer, was standing with several of his officers on an upper viewing platform of the superstructure. With a fierce eye, lined face and weather-beaten brow, hair as white as snow under his captain's hat, and a beard to match, he had been a quite intimidating presence when Alex, Amy, and Kiara had first boarded in Portsmouth, and had been as dismissive of the children as he had been skeptical of their mission. His attitude had softened as they journeyed north, particularly, Alex thought, because of the antics of Amy and Kiara, who were both generous with their time and their good humor, and were always happy to keep the crew amused, even if Amy was shy and reserved. The captain rested his hand to the rail above them, and called down to Kiara in his gruff, accented voice. Any minute now, Barashnia, he told her. You're all ready, I take it. Yep, she replied. Then she turned to Alex and the others. Over here, she said, ushering them all across the deck to the far rail, with Svalbard beyond. She rummaged in a small bag at her side and drew forth a compact digital camera. That's Mum's camera, explained Amy. Yep, agreed Kiara happily. She lent it to me and told me just to take as many photos as possible while we were away. Stupid me, I only just remembered I had it. She crossed the deck again to a crew member who was waiting there for directions, passed both the camera and the bag to him, then proceeded to talk the young man through usage of the device. Here it comes, called the captain. Kiara squealed in excitement and skipped back to the others. Turn around, she cried. You'll miss it. They each turned and looked out to sea. As they watched, the sun finally broke the horizon, a fiery disk sliding from behind the mountains, bathing the scene in orange and gold. The snow lit up like fire, and even the Red Sea seemed to glow. Scads of floating ice picked out in incandescent flares as the sun shone down upon them. Wow, gasped Amy, and Alex had to agree with that sentiment. It was one of the most spectacular sights he had ever set eyes upon. It was so beautiful, he briefly wondered how such terrible suffering could possibly be, how cruel man could be to his fellow man when sights like this existed for anyone who wanted to see them. They watched for several long moments, a stunned hush keeping them riveted to the view, until... Right, gang, time to turn around, said Kiara, ushering them all about again. They all turned to see the crew member holding the camera ready. Feeling amazingly at peace, Alex leant against the rail and looked around at his companions. Kiara had grabbed onto Amy, and they were each grinning cheesy grins, Amy's being slightly startled as well, and holding up V signs with their free hands. Marco was looking a little exasperated at their childish antics. Natalie still had her case slung over one shoulder, but she was smiling as she watched the Sakurai twins. Even River looked happier than he had ever seen her, a faint smile on her face. She glanced at him, and he grinned back at her before turning forward again. Say cheese, giggled Kiara. Cheese, echoed Amy. The camera clicked. Oh, end part 1 of this fucking video. It's taken ages. Ah, man. So, yeah, part 1. I hope you enjoy this story as much as I did. If you don't want to hear this sort of audiobook, go and read it. Look it up. It's Evangelion, The End and After Revelations by Carolee Burnford. Or Carolyn Burnford, or whatever, on DeviantArt only. Take care, folks, and good night.